They told me a garden couldn't grow in salt. 7 years ago, Yonsiak handed me a forged medical report like it was a death sentence, calling me empty and defective before discarding me for a woman whose womb came with a corporate merger. He didn't know I wasn't a garden. I was the entire earth. Today, he's celebrating his perfect union in the Grand Emerald Hall, a palace built on the lies he told to save his family's dying legacy. He thinks he's looking at his future. He doesn't realize I already bought the building this morning. And I didn't come alone. I brought the 2 impossibilities he claimed I could never produce, living, breathing proof that his mother's money couldn't buy my reality. The air in the Grand Emerald Hall was thick with the scent of lilies and old money, a suffocating sweetness that masked the rot beneath the floorboards. Yonsiak stood at the altar, looking every bit the Prince of Soul in a midnight tuxedo that cost more than a year of my old salary. Beside him, his bride-to-be was draped in layers of silk, a trophy for a man who valued optics over souls. They were seconds away from the I do that would cement their corporate alliance. Then the doors didn't just open, they surrendered. I stepped into the light, the weight of a royal blue silk gown flowing behind me like a sapphire river. Beside me was Kiachin, a man whose name made the city's elite look at their shoes in silent prayer. He wasn't just my husband, he was the architect of my restoration. But the real silence, the kind that makes hearts stop, came from the 2 small boys leading our procession. Zane and Cairo, 4 years old, dressed in gray waistcoats with their hands in their pockets, mirroring the dangerous confidence of the man who chose to be their father. I wasn't there to scream or beg. I was there to serve the foreclosure papers on the very hall they stood in. My revenge wasn't a tantrum. It was a hostile takeover. Hello, family. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments so I can send you special regards. And also, hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel. Now let's dive deep into the channel. The memory of the rain in Seoul always tasted like iron and heartbreak. 7 years ago, Jenny had stood in a sterile office, the white walls closing in on her as a doctor, handpicked by Yonsiak's mother, Madame Mayung, delivered the verdict that would shatter her world. "Barren," the man had said, his voice as cold as the stethoscope around his neck. "A complication of your history, Miss Jules. It is unlikely you will ever conceive." Jenny had felt the floor tilt. She was 28, a brilliant urban planner who had moved from Chicago to Seoul for a man she thought was her forever. She had designed parks for this city, but suddenly her own internal landscape was declared a desert. When she told Yonsiak that night, she expected a hand to hold. Instead, she got a cold calculation. "My mother says a leader without an heir is just a temporary occupant of the throne," Yonsiak had whispered, not even looking at her. "If you can't give the Yun family a future, Jenny, what are we even building?" 2 weeks later, the locks were changed. He didn't just break up with her, he erased her. He used his political influence to blackball her from the major firms, claiming her emotional instability regarding her medical condition made her a liability. She was left with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like it had been put through a paper shredder. She had ended up in a small, nameless bar near the Han River, the neon lights blurring through her tears as she drank soju and stared at her discarded blueprints. That was the night the shadows moved. Kiachin hadn't approached her like a predator. He had approached her like a strategist. He was a man of the shipping industry, a titan whose family had run the ports for generations, often operating in the gray areas where the law didn't dare to tread. He had sat down, ordered a glass of the most expensive whiskey the dive bar owned, and looked at the blueprint she had stained with tears. "You're the one who wanted to build the Oasis project," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through her grief. "The sustainable community center that the city council just rejected." "I'm the woman who can't build anything," Jenny snapped, her Chicago fire flickering through the exhaustion. Not a building, not a family. I'm defective, remember. Kia-chin didn't flinch. He reached out and turned the blueprint toward him. They didn't reject the project because it was bad. They rejected it because Yeonseok wanted to buy the land for a luxury mall. He didn't call you Barren because it was true. He called you Barren because it was the only way his mother could get him to leave you for the heiress of the construction conglomerate. Jenny froze. What? Madame Mayung didn't like your influence over her son, Kia-chin said simply. She paid that doctor 300 million won to sign that paper. You aren't empty, Jenny. You're just in the way. That was the first time Jenny saw the fire in Kia-chin's eyes, a dark, protective embers that promised more than just comfort. He didn't offer to save her. He offered to arm her. I have the resources to find the truth, he told her. And I have the patience to watch you take back everything they stole. But you have to stop crying over a man who is essentially a footstool for his mother. Jenny wiped her eyes, the salt stinging her cheeks. Why help me? Because, Kia-chin said, standing up and towering over her in a way that made the world feel small. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who destroy things. I'd like to see what happens when the woman who thinks she can make water defy gravity finally gets to build her empire. The reconstruction of Jenny Jules was not an overnight miracle. It was a 5-year siege. Under Kia-chin's quiet patronage, Jenny didn't just return to Chicago. She went underground. She spent 2 years working under an alias for a global firm in London, winning awards while the name Jenny Jules remained a cautionary tale in the Seoul social registers. But while her professional life was a calculated climb, her personal life was a revolution. The impossible happened 6 months after she married Kia-chin in a quiet ceremony on the cliffs of Jeju. When the first morning sickness hit, Jenny had wept on the bathroom floor, convinced it was a flu, a cruel joke, or a ghost. Kia-chin had been the one to bring the test. He had been the one to sit on the floor with her, holding her hand with a grip that could crush stone, but was as gentle as a breeze against her skin. When the 2 lines appeared, and then the ultrasound showed not 1, but 2 heartbeats, the Barren label didn't just fall off, it disintegrated. They are our legacy, Kia-chin whispered, watching the grainy images of Zayn and Cairo on the screen. And they will be the ones to walk through the doors their biological father tried to lock. As the twins grew, so did Jenny's reach. With Kia-chin's shipping empire providing the logistical backbone, Jenny began quietly buying up the distressed debt of the young group. Yeonseok, distracted by his failing marriage to a woman who loathed him and a mother whose greed was beginning to outpace her intelligence, didn't notice the Horizon Collective slowly surrounding his holdings. The twins, Zayn and Cairo, were the perfect fusion of their parents. They had Jenny's sharp, observant brown eyes and Kia-chin's unflappable stillness. By age 4, they didn't play with blocks. They studied blueprints with their mother and negotiated for extra dessert with their father using logic that would terrify a CEO. Jenny lived in a home made of glass and cedar, protected by high stone walls and men who moved like shadows, but she never felt like a prisoner. She felt like a queen in exile preparing for a homecoming. Is it time, Papa? Zayn asked one morning, watching Kia-chin check a set of legal folders. Kia-chin looked at his son, then at Jenny, who was draped in a royal blue robe, looking out over the Han River. It's time for your mother to collect a debt, he said. Jenny turned, her face a mask of serene power. She had the bank records. She had the recorded confession from the retired doctor in Bali. And she had the deed to the Grand Emerald Hall, the very venue Yeonseok had booked for his rebranding wedding after his first divorce became a public scandal. I don't want him to just see me, Jenny said, her voice steady. I want him to see what he lost, and then I want him to realize he never even deserved to be in the same room as the truth. The day before the wedding, Jenny sat in Kia Chin's basement office, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting in her eyes. On the screen was the final piece of the puzzle, the digital trail of the 300 million won. Madame Mayung was clever, Kia Chin said. Leaning over her shoulder, the scent of sandalwood and cold air clinging to him. She used 3 shell companies, but she forgot that my family owns the ports those companies claim to ship from. We tracked the consulting fees directly to the doctor's sister's account. Jenny clicked through the files. There it was, an email sent from a private server detailing exactly how the diagnosis should be phrased. Ensure the foreign woman understands that her biology is the failure, not our family's lack of interest, it read. The cruelty of it was a physical weight. They hadn't just wanted to end the relationship. They had wanted to destroy her sense of womanhood. They wanted her to leave Korea believing she was a broken vessel, so she would never have the confidence to challenge them again. He's at the rehearsal dinner right now, Kia Chin murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He's giving a speech about new beginnings and pure bloodlines. He has no idea the paternity tests for the twins are already sitting on his lawyer's desk, waiting for the office to open on Monday. No, Jenny said, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. I don't want him to find out from a lawyer in a quiet office. I want the world to see the moment his lie expires. She stood up, her gaze fixing on the royal blue gown hanging on the door. It was a statement of war. You're sure about the boys? Kia Chin asked, his protective streak showing. It will be a circus. Zane and Cairo are not secrets to be kept, Kia Chin, Jenny said firmly. They are the evidence. They deserve to see their mother stand her ground, and they deserve to see the man who tried to prevent their existence realize he has no power over them. That night, Jenny didn't dream of empty rooms or sterile offices. She dreamed of the Oasis Project, not as a blueprint, but as a finished building, full of light and children who would never be told they were impossible. Beside her, Kia Chin stirred in his sleep, his arm pulling her closer even in unconsciousness. He was the man the city feared, but to her, he was the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a creator instead of a resource. Tomorrow, she whispered into the dark. Tomorrow, he replied, his voice a vow. The corporate headquarters of the Yun Group was a jagged tooth of glass and steel biting into the Seoul skyline. To the public, it was a symbol of unshakable stability. To Jenny, looking at the heat maps and debt-to-equity ratios on her tablet, it was a house of cards leaning into a gale. For the last 3 years, Jenny had operated as the ghost architect of the Horizon Collective. While Yeon-seok was busy trying to maintain his social standing, Jenny had been working with Kia Chin's financial analysts to identify every fracture in the Yun Group's foundation. They hadn't just been buying stocks, they had been buying the debt. The Emerald Hall, Jenny murmured, tracing the digital outline of the wedding venue on her screen. It's the crown jewel of their real estate holdings. If they lose this, the bank calls in the loans on their entire residential portfolio. Kia Chin sat across from her in the private study of their Seoul villa, cleaning a vintage fountain pen with methodical precision. Madame Mayung used the hall as collateral for the merger with the construction conglomerate. She was so sure the wedding would seal the deal that she didn't read the fine print on the secondary mortgage. And who owns that mortgage now? Jenny asked, though she already knew the answer. We do, Kia Chin said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Technically, a subsidiary of the Jules Chin Foundation. You own the floor he's going to stand on when he says his vows. You own the ceiling he'll look up to. You own the air he breathes in that room. Jenny leaned back, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about the Oasis Project. For years, the Yun Group had blocked her dream of building a sustainable, low-income community hub because it sat on land they wanted for a luxury shopping mall. They had called her vision unprofitable and sentimental, the same words they had used to describe her. "I want the foreclosure notice served during the reception," Jenny said, her voice dropping an octave. "Not before. I want them to feel the highest peak of their success right before the ground vanishes." "It's aggressive," Kiachin noted, his eyes locking onto hers. "It will make you enemies of the entire board." "I was already their enemy when I was a penniless foreigner they could bully," Jenny countered. "Now, I'm an enemy they have to respect. There's a difference." The preparation for the hostile takeover was as much about psychological warfare as it was about legal filings. Jenny spent the afternoon with the twins, teaching them how to walk with their shoulders back. She didn't tell them they were going to a war zone. She told them they were going to a restoration. "Is it like building a bridge, Mommy?" Cairo asked, tilting his head as he watched her choose her jewelry. "Exactly like that," Jenny said, clipping on a pair of sapphire earrings that matched her gown. "Sometimes, to build a new bridge, you have to clear away the old, rotten wood that's blocking the path." As the sun began to set over the city, casting long, orange shadows across the floor, the weight of the moment began to settle. This wasn't just revenge. It was the final step in a 7-year architectural plan to rebuild her own soul. She wasn't the broken girl in the rain anymore. She was the woman who had built a life so grand that her past was now just a small, insignificant speck on the horizon. The black-armored SUV glided through the streets of Gangnam like a shark through dark water. Inside, the silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Zayn and Cairo sat in their matching gray suits, looking out the tinted windows at the bright lights of the city. Kiachin reached over and took Jenny's hand. His palm was warm, a stark contrast to the cold, nervous energy humming in her veins. "You don't have to do this for me," he said softly. "I would have handled this quietly if you asked." "I know," Jenny replied, "but I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the woman who sat in that doctor's office and believed she was less than a person because a rich woman told her so. I'm doing it so our sons never have to wonder why their father's side of the family is a hollow shell." As they approached the Grand Emerald Hall, the sheer scale of the event became clear. Valets were scurrying around a fleet of luxury cars. Paparazzi were gathered at the edge of the red carpet, hopping for a glimpse of the union of the century. "Wait for my signal," Jenny told the driver. She watched from the shadows of the car as Yeonseok's mother, Madame Mayung, stepped out of a limousine. She looked regal in a traditional hanbok, her face a mask of practiced arrogance. She was greeting the elite of Seoul, shaking hands with people she had lied to for decades to keep the Yun group afloat. Then came Yeonseok. He looked exactly the same, handsome in a generic, polished way. He had the same smirk he used when he thought he had won a negotiation. He had no idea that the barren woman he had discarded was currently holding the deed to the roof over his head. "Now," Jenny said. The SUV pulled up to the main entrance. The valet opened the door, and the air of the city rushed in, cold, sharp, and smelling of ozone. Kiachin stepped out first. The moment his feet hit the pavement, a ripple went through the crowd. The shadow king of the shipping industry didn't attend weddings, especially not this one. The cameras began to flash frantically. Then he reached back and took Jenny's hand. When Jenny stepped out, the blue of her dress seemed to drink in the light. She stood tall, her natural curls styled in a voluminous, regal crown. She didn't look like a guest, she looked like the owner. But the real gasp came when the twins stepped out. Zayn and Cairo didn't hide behind their parents. They stood on either side of Jenny, their gray suits sharp, their faces calm. The resemblance to Yeonseok was there in the shape of their eyes, but the fire in them was all Jenny. The crowd went silent. The math was being done in 100 heads at once. 7 years since the breakup, 4-year-old twins, the Barren scandal. Jenny didn't wait for them to process it. She began to walk. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Every step she took was a rhythmic pulse of power. She wasn't crashing a wedding, she was reclaiming a territory. At the entrance, the head usher, a man who had known Jenny years ago and had been the one to escort her out of the Yun building, stood frozen. "The guest list is private, madam," he stammered, his eyes darting to Kia-chin. Jenny didn't hand him an invitation. She handed him a legal folder. "I'm not a guest, I'm the landlord. And I'm here to inspect the property before I decide whether or not to evict the current occupants." She walked past him before he could find his voice. The interior of the hall was a cavern of white silk and pale flowers. The ceremony was already in progress. The officiant was speaking about unbreakable bonds and legacies that span generations. Jenny, Kia-chin, and the boys stood at the very back of the center aisle. The doors had been closed, but Kia-chin's security team had persuaded the guards to let them through. The click of Jenny's heels on the marble floor was like a gunshot in the silent room. Yeon-seok was halfway through his vows. "To honor the name I carry, and to ensure that the future of the Yun group is." He stopped. He had seen her. At first, his face registered confusion. Then, a flash of irritation. The old Yeon-seok who thought he could just tell her to leave. But then his eyes dropped to the two boys standing at her knees. The blood drained from his face so fast he actually swayed on his feet. The bride, a woman named Hana, turned around, her brow furrowed in confusion. Madame Mayung, seated in the front row, stood up so abruptly she knocked over her glass of champagne. "Jenny," Yeon-seok's voice was a ragged whisper that carried through the microphone. Jenny didn't stop until she was 20 feet from the altar. She stood in the center of the aisle, a blue flame in a white room. Kia-chin stood half a step behind her, his presence a silent warning to anyone who thought about intervening. "You look surprised, Yeon-seok," Jenny said, her voice clear and amplified by the acoustics of the hall. "I thought you'd be happy to see me. After all, you were so concerned about my health when we last spoke. You were so certain that I couldn't provide a future." She reached down and placed her hands on the shoulders of Zane and Cairo. "I'd like you to meet Zane and Cairo. They've been asking about the man who told their mother she was empty. I thought I'd bring them here to show them that emptiness is a choice, one you made when you traded your soul for your mother's approval." The room erupted in whispers. Madame Mayung marched toward them, her face contorted in a snarl. "This is an outrage. Security, get this woman and these actors out of here." "Don't touch them." Kia-chin's voice wasn't loud, but it stopped Madame Mayung in her tracks. He stepped forward, his eyes like flint. "If you so much as breathe in the direction of my family, the Yun group won't just be bankrupt. It will be a memory." Jenny looked directly at the bride. "I have no quarrel with you, Hana, but you should know that the man you're about to marry paid a doctor 300 million won to forge a medical report to get rid of me. He didn't just break a heart, he committed a felony. And he did it using the funds of the company you're about to merge your family's fortune with." Jenny pulled out a second folder, the forensic audit. "As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, the Grand Emerald Hall is under new management. The Horizon Collective has called in the debt. This wedding is currently taking place on my property, without a lease." She looked at Yeon-seok, who looked small, smaller than she ever remembered him being. "I'm not here to stop your wedding, Yeon-seok. I'm here to tell you that you're evicted. From this hall, from my life, and from the legacy you thought you could build on a lie." The twins looked up at their biological father. Zane, the older by 3 minutes, tilted his head exactly the way Kia-chin did. "You're the man who lied. he asked, his young voice echoing in the shocked silence. That was the moment the perfect union died. It wasn't with a scream, but with the simple, devastating question of a child who knew exactly who he was and exactly who his father wasn't. The silence in the Grand Emerald Hall was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum. Every guest, from the Minister of Land and Infrastructure to the socialites who had once whispered about Jenny's unfortunate condition, was frozen, their eyes darting between the woman in the royal blue gown and the shaking man at the altar. Yeonseok tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. Jenny, you're making a scene. This is a private event. Whatever legal dispute you have, we can settle it in the morning. There is no we, Yeonseok, Jenny said, her voice projecting with the practiced ease of a woman who spent her days presenting billion-dollar blueprints to boards of directors. And this isn't a scene. It's an audit. 7 years ago, you audited my worth based on a lie. You decided that if I couldn't be a vessel for your legacy, I had no value. Today, I am auditing yours. She walked toward the front row, where Madame Mayung sat. The older woman had regained some of her composure, her face hardening into a mask of pure venom. You think a few documents and some children prove anything? Madame Mayung hissed, her voice low so the microphones wouldn't catch it. You are still just a girl from the Chicago projects who doesn't understand how this country works. Money can make those documents disappear by midnight. Actually, madam, Kiachin intervened, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm as he stepped up beside Jenny. Money is exactly why you're losing. You see, while you were busy bribing doctors and trying to buy a daughter-in-law with a construction firm, my wife was busy buying your bank. The Horizon Collective doesn't just hold your debt, we hold your reputation. The evidence of your wire transfers to Dr. Han was sent to the National Tax Service 20 minutes ago. By tomorrow morning, you're pure. Bloodline will be the lead story on every news cycle in Seoul. The bride, Hana, suddenly ripped her hand away from Yeonseok's. She looked at him with a mix of horror and disgust. Is it true? She demanded. Did you forge a medical report to get rid of your pregnant girlfriend because your mother told you to? Hana, it's complicated, Yeonseok started. It's not complicated, Jenny interrupted. It's a pattern. He didn't just lie about me, he lied to you. He told you the Yun group was expanding. The truth is they are hemorrhaging assets. He needed your family's money to pay off the interest on the very hall we're standing in. You weren't a bride to him, Hana. You were a bailout. Hana looked at the massive diamond on her finger, then at the man she barely knew. Without a word, she unpinned her veil, let it fall to the floor in a heap of white lace, and walked down the aisle. She didn't look back. The union of the century had lasted less than 10 minutes. Jenny looked at the twins. Zane was watching the scene with a curious tilt of his head, while Cairo had his hand firmly tucked into Kiachin's. They weren't afraid. They were protected. The building is closed, Jenny announced to the room. The catering staff has been paid by my firm to pack up. Guests, I suggest you find another venue for your evening. The Yun family no longer has the authority to host you. As the room began to scramble in a chaotic exodus, Jenny felt a hand on her arm. It was Kiachin. The car is waiting. Do you want to stay for the final collapse? Jenny looked at Yeonseok, who had slumped onto the altar steps, his head in his hands. His mother was screaming into her phone, likely realizing that her connections were suddenly not answering. No, Jenny said, a strange sense of peace washing over her. The architect doesn't need to stay and watch the demolition. I've seen enough. I want to take my sons home. The weeks following the wedding were a whirlwind of legal filings and corporate restructuring. The Barren scandal became a national conversation about the ethics of the elite and the treatment of women in corporate dynasties. Jenny sat in her new office, a sun-drenched space on the top floor of a building she had designed herself. On her desk sat the final foreclosure notice for the Yun family estate. It was over. Madame Mayung had been forced into a voluntary retirement, and Yeonseok was facing a series of civil lawsuits that would strip him of whatever pride he had left. But Jenny didn't feel the rush of revenge she thought she would. Instead, she felt a profound sense of space. The weight she had carried for 7 years, the feeling that she had to prove her existence, was gone. Kia-chin walked in, carrying 2 small cups of gelato. "The boys are downstairs with the tutors," he said, handing her a cup. "Zane is trying to convince the history teacher that he should be allowed to design a fortress instead of drawing a map." Jenny laughed, the sound bright and real. "He gets that from you, the need for a stronghold. And the vision to make it beautiful comes from you," Kia-chin replied. He sat on the edge of her desk, his expensive suit looking out of place in the creative chaos of her office. "The city council called this morning. They've approved the Oasis project, not as a private development, but as a city-funded landmark. They want you to break ground next month." This was the true victory. The project that Yeonseok had tried to kill to build a mall was finally going to be a reality. It would be a center for mothers, for immigrants, for young architects who had nothing but a dream and a pencil. "I want to name the central courtyard after my mother," Jenny said softly. "And I want a plaque at the entrance, not with my name but with a quote, for those who were told they could never build." "It's perfect," Kia-chin said. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "You know, people still ask me why I helped you that night in the bar. They think I saw a business opportunity." "And what did you see?" "I saw a woman who was trying to hold up the sky with broken arms," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just wanted to be the one to build the pillars so you could finally breathe." Jenny leaned her head against his shoulder. Their relationship hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been a partnership forged in the fires of shared ambition and mutual respect. He had never saved her. He had simply provided the iron so she could forge her own sword. A knock at the door interrupted them. Cairo ran in, holding a drawing. "Mommy, look, I drew the garden for the new building. It has a fountain that goes all the way to the moon." Jenny took the drawing, her heart full. She looked at the scribbled lines of green and blue. This was her legacy. Not the bank accounts, not the ruined reputations of her enemies, but the absolute, unshakable confidence of her children. "It's a beautiful garden, Cairo," she said, kissing the top of his curly head. "And the best part, we're going to build it together." 3 years later. The opening of the Oasis project was the biggest event in the city's architectural calendar. The building was a marvel of glass and living greenery, a breath of air in the middle of the concrete jungle. Jenny stood on the podium, looking out at a crowd of hundreds. In the front row sat Kia-chin, looking as sharp and formidable as ever, with Zane and Cairo, now 7 years old, sitting proudly beside him. They were no longer the proof of a scandal. They were the heart of a family. Jenny didn't mention Yeonseok in her speech. She didn't mention the barren lie or the wedding she had crashed. Those things were ghosts, and she had no interest in haunting herself. "We build because we believe in a future we cannot yet see," Jenny told the audience. "We build because the world tells us no, and our hearts say, 'Watch me.' This center is not just a building. It is a promise that no one, no matter their status or their power, can define what you are capable of creating." After the ceremony, as the sun began to set, Jenny walked through the central courtyard. The air was filled with the sound of children playing and the soft murmur of the fountains. She saw a figure standing by the far gate, a man in a worn coat looking older than his years. It was Yeonseok. He wasn't there as a VIP, he was just a ghost on the periphery. He had lost everything, his company, his mother's favor, his standing. He was working a mid-level job in a satellite city far from the lights of Gangnam. He caught her eye and gave a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't an apology, it was an acknowledgement of defeat. Jenny didn't walk over to him. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back toward her family. She saw Kia-chin standing by the fountain, the twins running circles around him, their laughter echoing off the glass walls she had designed. "Mommy, come see the moon," Zane shouted, pointing at the pale silver disk rising over the skyline. Jenny walked toward them, her royal blue heels clicking on the stone, a sound that once signaled a takeover, but now simply signaled her arrival. As she reached Kia-chin, he wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her into the warmth of his side. "The project is a success, Jenny. You've changed the city." "No," Jenny said, looking up at the building, then at her husband, then at her sons. "We changed the story. The city was just the canvas." They walked out of the courtyard together, a family built not on bloodlines or corporate mergers, but on the stubborn, beautiful truth of their own existence. Behind them, the Oasis project glowed like a lantern in the twilight, a testament to the woman who was told she was empty and the man who knew she was an empire. The Han River flowed on, carrying the past away to the sea, leaving the shore clear for everything they would build next. End of story. Hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel if this story got your heart, and also stay tuned for more.